members of the Senate, of the House of Representatives. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
Hello everyone, and welcome to Prickles Gaming. Today we are capping off the World at War playthrough with the first analysis video on the channel. We'll be looking at 6 different battles covered in the game from both the European and Pacific theaters. Now if you enjoy the video, please like, subscribe, and share it around, as there is a significant amount of work put into this. A few notes before we get started though. I'm neither a historian nor an expert on the Second World War, so if you notice anything that is incorrect, please point it out to me in a comment so that I can make a correction in the description. I've left some sources down there that I've used. We will also not be able to cover every specific piece of these battles, so I encourage additional reading in the sources I have provided. Additionally, we will be discussing numerous adult themes, including war crimes and crimes against humanity, so viewer discretion is advised. With all that out of the way, let's jump into things.
Makin atoll. Little more than sand, trees, and a small Japanese military base. Miller's reconnaissance team landed there almost a week ago. Since then, we've heard nothing. The waiting's over. We're going in. For all we know, they're already dead. If what little we know about the Japanese is true, it might be better if they are.
The raid on Makin Island began on August 17th, with 2 companies of the 2nd Marine Raider Battalion landing on the island in the early morning. The raiders would advance inward from their landing site, eventually encountering fierce resistance from the Japanese garrison. Soon after, the Japanese would launch 2 banzai charges against the Marines, resulting in the near complete destruction of the Japanese forces on Makin Island. The raiders were unaware of this, and attempted to withdraw from the island as planned that night, but only 7 of the 18 boats were able to withdraw due to the strong surf present and the boat's outboard motors no longer working. The now exhausted and largely unarmed men, having lost their weapons while attempting to withdraw, attempted to surrender to the Japanese, but it is believed that the Japanese messenger was killed by a separated group of Marines who were unaware of the plan. The next day, the submarines that originally carried the Marines attempted to get them off the island, but they were harassed by Japanese planes and forced to dive. Eventually, the Marines would construct a raft, and the 72 remaining raiders would sail for 4 miles until they were picked up by the submarines. In the process, 9 Marines were inadvertently left behind during the withdrawal, and were beheaded by the Japanese. The admiral who ordered the executions was tried and executed by the Allies after the war for his crimes. So, hearing that, you're probably a little confused by the depiction in the game, as am I. The raid failed to meet many of its objectives, such as capturing intelligence and prisoners, but the mission in-game largely frames the raid as a success. A couple of interesting notes on the raid I found, however, include the involvement of James Roosevelt, the son of U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt, who was a Marine that participated in the raid and would be awarded the Navy Cross as a result of his participation. Additionally, the first enlisted Marine decorated with the Medal of Honor in World War II earned the award during the raid. Sergeant Clyde Thomason was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor after he was killed exposing himself to direct the fire of his platoon during the early engagements of the raid.
The rotten cancer of the Fascist Reich ravages Europe like a plague. Their relentless drive into our motherland steals the lives of men, women, and children alike. The arrogance of their leaders is matched only by the brutality of their soldiers. These are the darkest days of the Nazi occupation of Stalingrad.
Let's shift our attention to the Soviet front and the Battle of Stalingrad. Now, the Battle of Stalingrad was a massive battle, lasting over 5 months, so I'm definitely not going to cover it all here. I will be focusing generally on the battle during September 1942, when the mission Vendetta takes place. Now, I think the mission is a fairly good representation of how the battle stood in September. The opening scene of the mission depicts a squad being wiped out by German forces after taking a defensive position inside of a fountain. This placement makes sense, given that the 62nd Army had been reduced to around 90 tanks at this point in the battle, and the tanks were largely used as static strongpoints around the city. Additionally, numerous German bombers are depicted overhead. Although it's hard to tell if the density of the sorties being flown is accurate here, the scene does a good job at displaying Axis air superiority over Stalingrad, which would eventually decrease following the shift of air units to the North African front following the start of Operation Torch by the Allies. Now, let's talk about the target in the mission, General Heinrich Amsel. General Amsel isn't a real person, and was not assassinated on September 17th, but I think there is a decent historical comparison regardless. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, at the time a general, was the commander of the German Sixth Army during the Battle of Stalingrad. Paulus was a relatively green general who would not be assassinated, but would eventually surrender to the Soviets at Stalingrad on January 31st, 1943, largely resulting in the end of the battle on February 2nd. Paulus was promoted to Field Marshal by Adolf Hitler on January 30th, 1943. This move was largely seen as an attempt to prevent Paulus from surrendering, as Hitler cited the fact that no Prussian or German field marshal had ever surrendered. Paulus would go on to testify against Nazi leadership at the Nuremberg trials, and would eventually return to East Germany in 1953. 14 years and 1 day after he surrendered at Stalingrad, Paulus would die following a battle with ALS. The Battle of Stalingrad was a critical battle in the war, and it was the first time the Nazi government publicly acknowledged a failure in the war. The loss of numerous experienced forces, warplanes, and momentum began to paint the writing on the wall for the Nazi leadership about the eventual outcome of the war. Minister of Propaganda Joseph Goebbels would give his famous Sportpalast speech a few weeks after the conclusion of the battle, calling for total war against the Soviets, ultimately binding the fate of the German people with that of the Nazi leadership.
Years after the raid on Makin, we're heading up an all-out assault on Peleliu Island. No POWs to rescue this time. Our mission? Take the airfield and cripple their supply network. Alongside familiar faces, fresh-faced recruits. The older guys like Miller, Sergeant Sullivan, and myself. We're known as the old breed. Old. We're not even out of our 20s.
The Battle of Peleliu took place for over 2 months between September and November of 1944. By this point in the war, the U.S. forces had pushed closer to the Japanese mainland, and now had the ability to reach the mainland with bombers from captured air bases. The Japanese employed a new island defense strategy following a string of recent defeats from the Americans. The Americans were unaware of this change, and later engagements in the Pacific would become devastating battles of attrition. No longer relying on meeting the enemy at the beach, the Japanese would instead prepare an in-depth defense of the interior of the islands while harassing the landing forces. Additionally, the Banzai Charge was determined to be a waste of men and resources and was ultimately abandoned. This change in tactics is not reflected in game, and there are numerous depictions of Banzai Charges across the 3 missions taking place on Peleliu. The U.S. Navy would bombard the island for 3 days prior to the assault, and believed they were highly successful in destroying the Japanese forces. Most of the Japanese forces were unharmed, however, by the bombing, and they were particularly careful to avoid detection by the U.S. Furthermore, the Japanese had heavy artillery emplacements at the fortress located on the landing beaches known as the Point. The first day of the battle, displayed in Little Resistance, is a fairly accurate depiction of events. Numerous landing craft were sunk by the Japanese defenses, and when the Americans did land, they faced fierce, although limited, resistance by the small force close to the beach. Additionally, the Japanese attempted to counterattack using tanks, but this force was destroyed by American tanks, dive bombers, and naval guns, which is also represented. Now, I don't have too much on the battle for Peleliu's airfield, other than that the Japanese occupied numerous fortifications near the airfield, and they fiercely contested the advance of the Americans. Furthermore, the Marines did push directly across the airfield and suffered heavy casualties as a result. I'm not entirely sure of the involvement of Japanese armored units here, but it is possible. I also noticed that the battle for Peleliu's airfield took place on the second day of the battle, while the game also depicts it as taking place on the 15th of September. World at War's depiction of the attack on the Point and Burn 'em Out and Relentless isn't very accurate in my opinion. Now, a rifle platoon of the 1st Marines knocked out Japanese gun positions one at a time using smoke grenades for concealment. The game depicts in Burn 'em Out a push with flamethrowers, mostly, although smoke grenades are used, to be fair. Additionally, the gun positions at the Point would eventually be cleared out by a grenade that detonated the ammunition stored in the caves, rather than being directly captured by the Marines with the support of tanks and the Army Air Force. Additionally, the Japanese would go on to counterattack the Point, but this isn't depicted in the game. Now, after the battle for Peleliu, the 1st Marines Division would be out of action until they participated in the invasion of Okinawa in 1945.
We have lost many brave men, but their sacrifice is not in vain. Our tanks now form a line of steel so powerful that all German resistance will be crushed beneath its mighty treads. Today, we will watch as Seelow falls, along with all those foolish enough to stand in our way.
The Battle of the Seelow Heights took place between the 16th and the 19th of April, 1945. The assault by the Soviet forces was against a well-entrenched German force, but the Soviets had a significant numerical advantage. Numerous Soviet forces were concentrated for the attack, including the 3rd Shock Army featured in Their Land, Their Blood. It's unclear to me why Dmitri is captured at the start of the level, as German commanders made a tactical withdrawal from the front lines of defense at the Seelow Heights in anticipation of heavy artillery barrages from the Soviet forces. It's unlikely, in my opinion, that German troops would have had many captured Soviet forces at this point in the battle, but given that the mission start date here is August 18th, it is possible. Additionally, the success seen by the 3rd Shock Army in Their Land, Their Blood and Blood and Iron do not align with Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov's reports to Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, where he described that the battle on his front was not going as planned. Although the 3rd Shock Army did advance, it appears that their success was largely due to larger breakthroughs made by the 1st Ukrainian Front under Marshal Ivan Konev. The success of Konev's forces are ultimately considered as the deciding moment in this battle, and the push for Berlin as a whole, as it exposed the flank of other defending German forces and made their favorable defensive positions untenable. Overall, I think the Battle of the Seelow Heights is not represented as well as it could be in the game. Although the well-entrenched German positions are displayed in Their Land, Their Blood, and the fierce tank duels, along with the significant presence of field artillery, are shown in Blood and Iron, the depiction of the 3rd Shock Army's role is not faithful to the actual events. The Soviet victory at the Seelow Heights allowed the Soviet forces to complete an encirclement of Berlin within the next few days. Additionally, the rapid success of Konev's forces prevented German troops, now cut off from Berlin, from retreating to defend the city. The Germans were then forced to defend their exposed capital with only Volkssturm militia, air defense, police units, and a handful of shattered regular formations. An interesting note I found on the game's depiction of this battle, and I think this was ultimately a typo by the developers, but Blood and Iron, which is presented in the game as the end of the Battle of the Seelow Heights, actually takes place on August 16th in-game, the historical start of the battle. Meanwhile, Their Land, Their Blood takes place on the 18th of August, one day before the battle would end. So the game presents kind of a weird timeline here. The Soviets win the battle in-game on the 16th, but then Dmitri is captured and freed on the 18th during the start of the battle for the Seelow Heights. Something doesn't quite add up here, and I largely think it was a typo, and that Blood and Iron was meant to take place on August 19th, the true end of the battle.
Fortune smiles on us! In Berlin, the Germans will truly see what they have unleashed. In the midst of all the blood, the bullets, and the dead, I found that an old friend was still very much alive. Dmitri Petrenko. I saw this man cheat death time after time at the siege of Stalingrad. As long as he lives, the heart of this army cannot be broken. He makes us all proud.
With the line at Seelow now broken, nothing stands between the Red Army and Berlin. Every day, we carve deeper into German territory. Every day, fear and desperation erode their will. When our train reaches Berlin, they will have nowhere left to hide.
The Battle of Berlin would officially begin on April 16th with the onset of the Battle of the Seelow Heights, but direct Soviet shelling of the city began on the 20th of April 1945, the 56th birthday of Adolf Hitler. Throughout the 23rd and 24th of April, Soviet forces made steady progress in advancing through the city as depicted in Ring of Steel and Eviction, although casualties were significant. The German defense, however, was largely shattered, as I mentioned before, and was made up of broken regular formations, Volkssturm militia units, boys from the Hitler Youth, and the police. The end of Eviction features a flooding of the metro station the Soviet forces are currently pushing through. On April 19th, Hitler issued what's called the Nero Decree, which instructed German forces to destroy key infrastructure to prevent it from falling into the hands of the Allies. Now, in Berlin, the SS would blow nearly half of the bridges, and their actions resulted in the flooding of nearly a quarter of the city's metro system, ultimately killing thousands of civilians who sought protection from the violence underground.
The Red Army encircles the Reichstag, the parliament building and final stronghold of the fascist Reich. In the surrounding streets, we choke the life from those who will still dare to defend it. It is an honor and a privilege to play a part in this glorious battle. When our flag flies over the city, our enemies' defeat and humiliation will be beyond question. Our vengeance will be complete.
Now, despite the resistance, the Soviets pushed forward closer to the Reichstag. I find it interesting that the start of Heart of the Reich sees Dmitri being pulled out of the flooded metro station, but this level takes place 6 days after Eviction. Regardless, on April 30th, the Soviets made their advance on the Reichstag, hampered by the presence of German flak cannons. The game depicts these cannons on a forum in front of the Reichstag, but in reality, these cannons were on top of the flak tower located at the nearby Berlin Zoo. Now, the building was unused following the Reichstag fire in 1933, and the defenders were able to use this to their advantage and significantly entrench, and this is depicted in the game with a lot of the rooms being severely destroyed and damaged. Heavy room-to-room fighting followed over multiple days until May 2nd, when the Soviet forces would finally secure the building. So, while the Soviet flag was not planted on top of the building on April 30th as the game depicts, I think the fierce room-to-room combat featured is quite representative here. Now, the war in Europe was largely over, but the official German surrender would not come until May 8th.
Status report? The last few months on Okinawa have taken their toll. Morale is low. It's the rain, sir. And the mud. Tanks are getting bogged down. Supplies aren't getting through. We can't even get the wounded out. Yes, sir. Understood. Tell him in.
The Battle of Okinawa, the bloodiest battle of the Pacific, took place from April 1st to June 22nd of 1945. I'm going to be specifically focusing here on the events from mid-May to the end of May, when the missions in World at War take place. This portion of the battle was largely a slog, resembling the battlefields of World War I, with the heavy presence of mud as a result of the monsoon rains. American forces won 2 strategic victories over key Japanese defensive points flanking Shuri Castle during this time period, and the American commanders had hoped to encircle the Japanese defenders at the castle. Blowtorch and Corkscrew does a decent job at displaying the brutality and the conditions of the battle and how it was fought. Breaking Point, I believe, however, is not a very accurate representation of what went on at Shuri Castle. It's depicted as the final stand for the Japanese forces on the island, when in reality the castle was largely abandoned following the shelling from the Navy. The last line of defense was not at Shuri, but rather at the Kion Peninsula. The Japanese military forces and civilians there found themselves trapped between U.S. forces and the ocean. Over 4,000 Japanese soldiers would commit suicide to prevent being captured, and numerous civilians were also killed as American forces struggled to differentiate between Japanese forces and civilians. Additionally, the Japanese forces used the civilian population as human shields, pressed them into service, and in some cases, executed them outright. Some military historians make the case that the brutal battle for Okinawa resulted in the decision to use the atomic bomb on the Japanese mainland, but this isn't a consensus view. Hiroshima would be bombed on August 6th, and Nagasaki would follow on the 9th. The bombs would kill hundreds of thousands of civilians. The Soviet Union would declare war on Japan on the 9th as well, and Japan would surrender 6 days later, closing out the global conflict on August 15th, 1945.
It is solemn. General Eisenhower informs me that the forces of Germany have surrendered to the United Nations. The victory won in the West must now be won in the East.
Gathered here representatives of the major warring powers to conclude a solemn agreement whereby peace may be restored. It is my earnest hope, and indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past. A world founded upon faith and understanding of man and the fulfillment of his most cherished wish of freedom, tolerance, and justice.
The Second World War brought unparalleled destruction into the world. With estimated death tolls as high as 85 million people, the world was shattered, and it would take years to recover. A new conflict was brewing on the horizon, a conflict that was less direct, but critical in shaping the world as we know it today. As we approach the 80th year anniversary since the end of the war, and the last people who lived through the era begin to pass, I find it increasingly important to analyze the atrocities carried out during the period. With ever-intensifying political extremism, violence, and hatred, we must take every opportunity to learn the lessons of the past to not make the same mistakes. This has been Prickles Gaming, and I will see you all in the next episode.